Now, this is part B of the Khoodeelaar television channel being broadcast online only on the internet from London in the UK on Monday, the 17th of May 2021. And the diagnosis of Fleet Street includes the diagnosis of mainstream television channels and online so-called journalists, typified in this edition by somebody called Paul Waugh, W-A-U-G-H. Now, Paul Waugh is one of the people who regularly gets platforms on the mainstream television channel, although he doesn't run a television channel. He runs an online political so-called website for business, for profit. And he's typically misleading. Most of the times he's misleading, and he misleads in favor of the lying regime fronted by Boris Johnson. He's not the only one, but he is typical of the ones that are operating in that way. And today's online kind of coverage by Paul Waugh of the actual evidence and the impact of the Indian variant and strain of the COVID-19 virus in the UK shows that he has underestimated the number of people actually infected with the Indian variant of the virus, more than twice. So he has said that it's about 1,000 cases of infections in the UK linked to or with the Indian variant. Whereas Sky News posted a few hours after Paul was under representation of the actual numbers that more than 2,300 cases of infection and disease linked to the Indian variant. And that figure has been attributed by Sky News to Matt Hancock, the so-called health secretary. Now, these people, all of them, are morally compromised, one way or the other. Matt Hancock, Priti Patel, Boris Johnson, David Cameron, the whole lot of the conservatives and conservative-linked individuals have been involved in looting and robbery and corruption, multi-billion pound corruption altogether, all of them put together. So this is important to point out that when we say that we are diagnosing Fleet Street, that is the printed newspapers, we are not confining the diagnosis to the contents of the printed newspapers only. In addition to and besides Paul Waugh, even Sky News' political editor, Beth Rigby has been exposed repeatedly as being an agent of Boris Johnson's propaganda. And she has even this afternoon posted a tweet repeating what Matt Hancock said. And that is a propaganda line that she has repeated. It's not fact, it's not scientific evidence. And the likes of Paul Beth Rigby are knowingly spreading lies and making false statements and abusing their positions, and there is no accountability. There is no forum, there is no platform that actually can be used by people who are concerned about the need for the truth and only the truth to be told by the media, can go to the people who are aware of the lies and falsification by the media, by personnel like Beth Rigby, Paul Waugh et al., cannot go and seek remedies against the lies and lying and falsification by these media personnel and media outlets. And there was a series of comments that we have posted just coming online on this one, commenting on the BBC presenter, radio presenter, Sheila Fogarty. Now, Sheila Fogarty is a woman that is among the fascistic kind of brigade of women appointed by the BBC. The other one is, of course, Fiona Bruce, who mispresents the BBC Question Time on BBC One television. She's a racist, she's a fascist, and she's a person with contempt. Nothing but contempt for democracy, accountability. And so is Sheila Fogarty. And these people are allowed platforms without there being any redress against their lying and lies. And they are endangering public safety. And they are misusing their platforms to brainwash the already predisposed brainwashable gullibles. The gullibles are the people who actually voted for Brexit, and they would vote for anything like Brexit without thought, without understanding, without looking at the consequences of their voting. And their counterparts on a local level exist in boroughs like Tower Hamlets, like Newham, where on the 6th of May, the so-called voters were shown to have voted to retain the corrupt post of elected mayor, both in Tower Hamlets and in Newham. And this record is abysmal because in the established procedure for getting rid of the elected mayor post, the corrupt elected mayor post, there is no option for the ordinary electors to use the electoral process to get rid of this corrupt, criminalizing post. Now, why is that important? Because at every level of public service and action supposedly intended to help people in deprived boroughs like Tower Hamlets, like Newham, because the majority of the demography in Tower Hamlets and in Newham actually are made up people coming from abroad, not indigenous white Anglo-Saxon. There are Anglo-Saxon people, but the majority in both boroughs are from other countries. And in the case of Newham, the people who make up the demography and the electorate in Newham are people from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and people from the Caribbean. And in Tower Hamlets, the people who make up the demography of the electorate are people from Poland, who are comparatively recent component of the demography, and people from Bangladesh and indigenous white people, and some people from the Caribbean, and some from the Indian and Pakistani backgrounds, but their numerical presence is smaller than that of the Bangladeshis of the subcontinent. Whatever the demography, the proportion, the ratio of the people in poverty and deprivation is significantly high in Tower Hamlets as in New York, higher than the average kind of level of poverty and deprivation in England. And by definition, as we have said about the highly active criminal gangs in Tower Hamlets, the level of criminality within communities in Tower Hamlets is too high. And that is in contrast to the criminality that might exist in a mainly white populated borough, for example, in the west of London, or in Camden, for example, or in Wandsworth. The criminality in Tower Hamlets is encouraged by the status quo. There is no policing against criminality in Tower Hamlets. And likewise, there is none in Newham. The only policing about any crime that the public gets to hear about occurs when there has been a kind of murder of the young people, mainly young people murdering other young people. After the crimes, after the young person or persons have been murdered, there is hardly any preventive or preventative policing in Tower Hamlets or in Newham. And looking at the estates infested by criminal gangs active in Tower Hamlets, it is absolutely impossible to find any presence of the police. As to why that is a matter that we shall discuss at another time. But what this does is what we are going to discuss a bit here. When the criminals, who are mainly aged under 30 years, let's say, and any number of criminals congregate and create mayhem on the estate, there is no chance that anyone who is older and living in their home, so-called, would dare come out and confront them. No way. Why? Because unlike the gangs of criminals who always manage to get together in numbers, the individual older persons cannot organize other older persons in the same number. And even if they did, they would not be able to kind of sustain any confrontation or any challenge or any societal kind of statement addressing the gangs. Why? Because the gangs know, as do the older people, as to the victims of the estates, that there will be no backup for the ordinary residents. No backup from the police, no backup from the local council, and most certainly no backup follow-up from the locally linked elected councillor or councillors. So it's a criminals free for all, or criminals kind of space and time and reign that prevails on the estates in Tower Hamlets. And when the police have been in the past historically, more than 20 years ago, because the police in Tower Hamlets have ceased to even visit crime infested, gangs dominated estates in the borough. So, in effect, the police and the gangs of criminals are operating a kind of agreement or agreed denial of basic peace in the estates, on the estates across Tower Hamlets. Now, just as we have said about the Tower Hamlets Council's negligence of the safeguarding the children duties, especially in relation to the 4 Bethnal Green school girls. So, in the case of the criminals dominating the council estates or housing estates in Tower Hamlets, the councillors have been absolutely silent. And councillor silence is not just incidental, one-off. It is the norm. Councillors not only don't say anything about the anti-democratic, anti-social, illegal behavior of the regime fronted by an incumbent in the corrupt post of mayor. Councillors also behave as if they are politically dead, even physically absent, when the criminals dominate the housing estates across Tower Hamlets. And when that happens, all manners of crime, other crime or crimes take place. And this goes on for years. This has been going on for the last at least 20 years, if not for longer. And it is not just the housing estates, it's also isolated so-called social housing buildings. Not all social housing is based or situated in estates, that is a group of buildings. Some of the buildings are isolated from other buildings, and when the criminals dominate, they take over the staircases or the stairs and the access entrances to the particular buildings. And the criminals sit there or stand there and they do all kinds of criminal antisocial things. And there is nobody to witness. You don't see a single person passing by. What that means is that most people who are supposed to be residents in their homes, in the buildings affected by the criminals taking over, they don't come out. So for 20 years, council and housing estates in Tower Hamlets have been in effect, lockdowns. It has been a voluntary lockdown in which most of the residents keep themselves indoors and they don't go out. They don't go shopping. They don't go for exercise. They don't go for socializing. They are and have been in prisons of their own kind of enforced choosing. And the elected councillors know this. And the elected councillors maintain total position of denial, being in denial of that knowledge. So the elected councillors in Tower Hamlets who know this and who maintain silence despite the knowledge, that that is going on, are engaged in effect in crimes. The councillors are committing crimes by aiding and abetting the criminal gangs. And this includes councillors of all descriptions, councillor the surface at the time of the next election or at the time of the kind of when they need to add something on their CVs that they're doing something. And in the period of the actual lockdowns, these criminals, also known as the councillors, have been appearing on this kind of online shows and kind of broadcasts. Now, that doesn't involve them going to the estates and going to the voters' doors and helping the voters, finding out what the voters have been suffering from. And this is the reality. This has been going on for years, for a generation. If it is 20 years, it's for a generation. For example, there used to be a police constable that supposedly used to police one building in an estate in Tower Hamlets, say 20 years ago. But the police constable refused to arrest any of the criminals, gangsters that dominated and occupied the building, the communal areas, and taunting and attacking and intimidating, threatening residents. One white man who moved into a flat on the ground floor of a particular building during the late 1990s. A white man, probably aged in his 30s, who was a typical white man in Tower Hamlets, in a kind of so-called social housing building. It was not social by any stretch of the imagination. It was plagued by criminal gangs, Bangladeshis, entirely Bangladeshi criminals on all sides. And this man was typical because he said, when asked why he had moved into that dangerous flat, because the criminals dominated his front door, outside his front door, about 20 to 30 criminals would assemble on the passage, and he said they're just kids. Now that is the most stupid statement made by a person who knew that the gang of criminals were far from being kids. It was not long after that the same white person was physically forced to leave his flat and leaving behind all his belongings because the criminals told him to go. So the police are not there, the councillors are not there, and the residents are in a state of siege. It's a state of siege, or states of siege, or estates under siege by criminals in Tower Hamlets, who fathers and mothers these criminals. Of course, these are Bangladeshi people, and there is no mention of these criminals' behavior in any Bangladeshi kind of forum, so-called. The so-called Council of Mosques, completely silent, because these people are related. The Council of Mosques is made up of people who are totally anti-democratic, and they defy all the objective, basic criteria and the duties of care simply does not exist. Now, how many racists would know that? Because most of the racists in Tower Hamlets know that. Tower Hamlets racists like Mark, this criminal who does the thing called, used to do the thing, Love Walking. It's a website or blog. This criminal, Mark Brain, knows the criminal activities right across Star Owners, but he never, ever publishes any of this. So there is a collusion and a conspiracy between the racists in the so-called media, the racists in the Labour Party, the elected Bangladeshi councillors, and the police in Tower Hamlets. They aid and abet the criminal gangs. And there is absolute radio silence about all of this on the part of the councillors, and there is no mention of this in the published and public records of the Tower Hamlets Council, so-called. And the elected mayor is a criminal in every sense of the word. No elected mayor has ever spoken about the criminals, let alone the fact that they should be prosecuted. No statement has been made by any member of Tower Hamlets, any MP from Tower Hamlets, two Tower Hamlets constituencies. And the same applies to Newham. The two local MPs, Stephen Timms and Lynn Brown, are as silent as their Tower Hamlets counterparts. And none of this is to be found ever in the Daily Mail or the Scum or the Express or the London Evening Standard. The only time the criminality is included in the reports is when it suits the racist agenda of the Daily Mail, the Scum, the Express, and the Evening Standard. In that, they want to damn the whole community. And when that happens, most of the community, the damn, is the victim of the criminals, not the criminals themselves. So, for example, when the Fleet Street papers talk about something called county lane or country lane, drug trafficking, they are not talking about the criminality that is destroying lives of ordinary people, nothing to do with drugs, but the criminals taking over the communal spaces outside the homes of people on the council estates, on the housing estates. The Daily Mail, the Scum, the Express, the Evening Standard, so the BBC and ITV's kind of television counterparts, the London programs, they are completely silent about all of this. Now, how many people are affected? How many people's lives are ruined? It's altogether, it's hundreds of thousands of lives are being ruined every year. Peace of mind is gone, and there is a preponderance of illnesses that are brought on by the stress. So this is the world exclusive diagnosis of Fleet Street and what Fleet Street leaves out and what Fleet Street's agenda is as exposed by the silence like this. we shall be ending this edition at this time, and we shall continue in the next